It started out like any other year. I woke up early in the morning feeling the excitement in my chest. Today was our day. 4 years. 4 years in which I had made sure that Jessica was someone I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. We'd been together seemingly forever, and with each passing year it only seemed to grow stronger, closer, or at least it seemed that way to me. I loved this day. Every year I tried to do something special to show her how important she was to me. Jessica always reciprocated, or at least it seemed that way. Tonight, I had planned a little surprise, a romantic dinner at our favorite restaurant where we'd been on our first date. Chester was to join us too. He's been a friend of ours for years, and in a way has become part of our family. Looking back, though, I realized that he may have been too close to our family. When I opened my eyes, Jessica was still asleep. Her face looked peaceful, as if all the cares of the world had bypassed her. I stared at her for a long time, trying to capture that moment of happiness, to remember her as I had always wanted her to be. The thought that having her around was a gift I deserved gave me a sense of elation, but something was still wrong. A slight, subtle sense of unease was creeping somewhere in the back of my mind, though I couldn't immediately recognize it. Maybe it was just a premonition, but I didn't want to pay it any mind. Today was our day, after all, and I didn't want anything to mar it. Jessica woke up a little after I did. She looked up at me and smiled, but her smile wasn't the same as before. A barely perceptible insincerity flashed across her face, like a shadow that fades away when you barely try to look at it. I looked away, hoping it was just morning sleep or a random thought that had thrown me off. We exchanged the usual words of greeting, and I didn't ask any unnecessary questions. "Are you planning something today?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the bed and stretching. Her voice sounded familiar, but I caught a note of detachment in it. "Yeah," I answered, trying to keep my spirits up. "I thought we'd go to the restaurant where we'd first been. And then Chester will join us. You don't mind, do you?" "No, of course not," she answered quickly, though her eyes darkened a little. "It's a good plan." There was that feeling again. Like she wasn't fully with us at this moment. Like her thoughts were hovering somewhere far away. I wanted to ask what was wrong with her, but decided not to go any deeper. Maybe I was just winding myself up. After all, years of relationships teach us that we can't expect constant euphoria. Time makes feelings calmer, but that doesn't make them any less important. She quickly got out of bed and said she had to go out. This was unexpected. Usually on days like this, we tried to spend the morning together, planning the evening and discussing future plans. But today was different. "I'll be right back," Jessica said, throwing on her jacket. "I have a little business in town." I was alone. Something inside of me was making me uneasy, but I tried to drown it out. It was probably just fatigue or nerves. I turned on the TV trying to distract myself, but the screen was just noise in the background of my thoughts. At some point, I even caught myself staring at the same point, not noticing what was on the screen. The time dragged on slowly. Jessica returned a couple hours later, but now she was wearing the same detached expression I'd noticed that morning. She tried to appear happy, joyful, but I knew her too well not to notice the falseness. We started getting ready for the evening. I picked out the best shirt she had once given me, hoping that this evening would be a reminder of how important we were to each other. Jessica dressed nicely too, but something about her demeanor made me uncomfortable. She didn't look me in the eye as much as she used to. Every glance she gave me seemed to pass me by. Chester joined us a little later as planned. We met outside the restaurant, and he was in a good mood as always. His jokes and smiles seemed genuine, and I tried to convince myself that it was all just a figment of my imagination. But there was something strange here, too. I couldn't help but notice the way Jessica and Chester were looking at each other. Every time she laughed at his jokes, I caught myself thinking that that laugh sounded different, like it was meant just for him. At dinner, I tried to make conversation, but the feeling that something invisible stood between us never left me. It wasn't just a threesome. It was an evening in which I felt superfluous. Every look they gave me, every short line between them reminded me that I wasn't the only one who mattered in this company. After dinner, we headed back home, and I was greatly relieved when Chester left. I wanted to talk to Jessica, but she was distant again, said she was tired and needed sleep, retired to another room as she sometimes did when she really wasn't feeling well. But this night, I couldn't sleep. Something in me told me I should have noticed it sooner. Something important was eluding me, and now I couldn't bring myself to ignore those thoughts. I lay there in the dark, hearing the ticking of the clock, and I couldn't find peace. My thoughts kept returning to those looks, to those moments when I'd seen her with Chester. It was stupid, I knew. They were friends. But something was keeping me on edge. I couldn't explain why these thoughts wouldn't let me go. I got out of bed, walking to the kitchen for a drink of water. I was standing at the window, looking out at the city at night, when I heard their voices, Jessica and Chester. After that night when I heard Jessica and Chester's voices in her room, my mind was in a suspended state. It was like something elusive that slipped into the shadows of my thoughts and hid behind every attempt to explain everything. Perhaps it was just my imagination. But still, I couldn't shake the anxiety that was slowly rising like a tidal wave and refused to let go. The morning came as usual, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. Jessica acted as if nothing had happened. She was still affectionate, but her demeanor seemed more detached to me. She didn't ask questions about how I'd slept, nor did she show her usual concern. We ate breakfast in silence, and the silence seemed heavy. I tried to convince myself that the restlessness in my head was just the result of my fatigue. After all, I'd always had a tendency to overthink things, to look for problems where there were none. Our relationship with Jessica had been strong, and could I really assume that something serious had developed between us? But then there were the little things, very tiny details that were hard to describe in words, but that piled up and kept me busy. Like her cell phone. It used to always be in plain sight, on the kitchen table, on the nightstand next to the bed. We never hid anything from each other. It was part of our trust. But over the past few weeks, I'd noticed that she kept the phone to herself more and more, as if it had become something private, forbidden to prying eyes, including mine. I tried to ignore it, but whenever she quickly minimized the screen or dropped the phone into her bag as I approached, I was overcome with an uncomfortable feeling. There were other moments too, conversations that seemed too superficial, as if she no longer wanted to discuss important things with me. The time she began to spend away from home, the sudden trips and errands I knew nothing about. We used to always discuss plans, know who was doing what and when, but now she was leaving more and more often without telling me where she was going. And I didn't ask, because I was afraid of hearing an answer I might not like. This went on for weeks, and though I tried not to dwell on these little things, suspicions grew like weeds, filling every corner of my mind. Nothing seemed to be wrong, but the feeling of unease slowly became the backdrop of my life. We still spent time together, but I couldn't feel around her the way I used to. I began to notice every gesture she made, every change in tone, trying to figure out what was behind her words. Chester was still a part of our lives, too. The three of us met often, going to the same restaurants as before, laughing at his jokes. But now every visit from him made me strangely uneasy. He was still the same, but his presence was beginning to feel foreign to me. I noticed that Jessica and Chester sometimes glanced at each other, as if there were some unspoken conversation between them that I wasn't privy to. Of course, I tried to ignore it, but those moments became more noticeable each time. One day, a week after our anniversary, I came home from work earlier than usual. It had been a rough day, and I decided we needed to spend some time together. I wanted to make dinner and have a night in front of the TV like we used to do when there was no cause for concern. But when I walked into the house, Jessica was already there. She was sitting on the couch with her phone in her hands, and as soon as I walked in, she quickly put it in her pocket. It was so obvious that I couldn't ignore it. I didn't even have time to say hi before her behavior immediately caught my attention. "You're early," she said without looking up at me. "Yeah, I decided to come back early," I replied, trying to sound as natural as possible. But this brief interaction made me feel very uncomfortable. All evening, she had avoided looking at me, as if she was afraid I would notice something. We sat across from each other at dinner, and I caught myself thinking that I was spending more and more time in silence, trying to sort out my thoughts. Something had changed. It was obvious, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I tried to remember when it had started. When had Jessica become so aloof? Was there a specific moment that set this process in motion? Or did it happen gradually? Maybe it started a few months ago when she started staying late at work more often. Or when she started going to the gym where I never had time to follow her. These were all little changes that I used to write off as just normal household nuances, but now they were adding up to one big question. Every time I tried to talk to her about it, she either brushed it off or changed the subject. This only served to increase my anxiety. I could feel the chasm growing between us, but I couldn't figure out what was causing it. And worst of all, I didn't know how to fix it. A few days later, we met up with Chester again. This time, I watched them both more closely, trying to figure out what was going on. Everything looked the same as usual, but it seemed to me that their every look, their every smile, was something more than just friendship. They were laughing at some joke I'd missed, and I suddenly realized I felt like an outsider in my own life. After dinner, when Chester left, I finally decided to talk to Jessica. We were sitting in the living room, and I couldn't hold back any longer. "You've changed somehow," I began, trying to find words that wouldn't sound accusatory. "I feel like you're different. You've been spending more time out of the house lately, and I don't know, something just doesn't feel right." She was silent for a long time, looking at me as if she didn't know what to say. I was already expecting her to brush it off like she usually did, but instead she said, "Maybe you're just getting yourself worked up. It's okay, Jeff, really. I just have a lot of work to do right now, and I'm a little tired." Her answer was so calm, so logical, that I felt like an idiot for bringing it up at all. Maybe she really is right. Maybe I'm making up my own problems that don't really exist. But the doubts still remained. She kept talking, but I couldn't hear her words anymore. I was thinking about the fact that I had to do something. I had to find a way to put things back on track, to make sense of my suspicions. I soon realized, however, that the more I tried to talk about our relationship, the further away she became. Her explanations were always logical, but something about them didn't add up. A few more weeks passed, and my state of mind became increasingly anxious. The suspicions didn't disappear, but rather accumulated like a heavy weight that I carried with me every day. I tried to convince myself that perhaps all my thoughts and suspicions were simply the result of fatigue, but each new detail only increased my anxiety. Jessica was staying out more and more often, and I began to notice that almost every time she appeared, there was a mention of Chester. I wouldn't have given it much thought if it hadn't been for one odd thing. She talked about him more often than she used to. For example, once when I suggested we go to the store together, she replied that she'd already been there with Chester that morning. These moments used to seem natural. After all, they were old friends and sometimes spent time together. But now, something about it made me uneasy. On one such day, when I got home from work, Jessica wasn't home again. I tried to occupy myself with something to keep my mind off it, but the evening was long and empty. With each hour of waiting, I became more and more immersed in my thoughts. When she finally returned, I saw the same familiar smile, but it hid something behind it that I couldn't explain. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to speak calmly. "Not bad," she replied, tossing her bag onto the couch. "I went out with Chester. We went out for coffee." Chester again. I nodded, trying to hide my growing unease. At times like this, I always thought that maybe I was just too jealous or insecure. But there was something about the way she talked about him that made me feel unnecessary. She didn't explain herself, didn't give details like she used to. It was said as if in between, like something taken for granted. And it was this in-between that was slowly driving me crazy. A few days later, I got home from work early. I had to take the day off because all my thoughts were focused on Jessica and her behavior. As I approached our house, I heard voices from the side of the terrace. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as I got closer, I recognized her laughter. It was a laugh I hadn't heard from her in quite a long time. Light, carefree, full of life. And next to it was Chester's voice. They were sitting on the terrace, drinking wine and talking. I froze in place, hesitating to come closer. They were so absorbed in their conversation that they didn't notice me. Their faces were too close, their eyes shining with a special light. For a moment, I thought I was watching strangers, someone I didn't know. The whole moment seemed alien, unreal, as if I was out of my life. I stood like that for a few more minutes until I heard Chester laugh and say something quietly, but clearly enough for me to hear it. "You always knew how to make me feel special." Jessica smiled back, and in that moment I saw what I feared most. Their gazes met, and it wasn't just a friendly interaction. It was something more, something that made me feel the ground go from under my feet. I could no longer stand there and watch. I walked sharply into the house, slamming the door so that they would realize I was home. Their voices immediately quieted down. A few seconds later, I heard Jessica get up and walk toward me. "Oh, you're home already," she said, as if nothing had happened as she walked into the living room. "Chester and I decided to sit out on the patio for a while, to relax. Did you have a long day?" I looked at her, trying to keep my anger under control. Her face was calm, as if nothing had happened. I could see her trying to appear natural, but her eyes said otherwise. I sensed that something between them was clearly not what she was trying to make it seem. "Yeah, it's been a long day," I replied, looking away. "And you seem to be having fun." "We were just talking," she said with a slight smile. "You know, Chester can always lighten the mood." She kept talking, but I wasn't listening anymore. All I could think about was what I had just seen a few minutes ago. It wasn't just friendship. It was something more. Something she didn't want to discuss, or maybe she was just hiding. I couldn't ignore the sensations any longer. My heart was beating so hard that it felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. That was the moment I realized that something had really broken between us. Chester soon left, and I was left alone with Jessica. She continued to act like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. She sat down next to me, picked up the TV remote, and started changing channels like it was just a normal evening. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. "What's going on between you and Chester?" I finally asked, unable to hide my thoughts any longer. Jessica gave me a quick glance, a shadow of surprise in her eyes, but only for a moment. She immediately regained her composure. "Nothing," she replied. "We're just friends, you know that." Her answer was so nonchalant that it only infuriated me more. She looked at me like I was asking something irrelevant, like my words didn't matter. I could feel a sense of powerlessness building up. Everything was so wrong, but she kept pretending everything was fine. "Then why do you spend more time with him than you do with me?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Why do the two of you sit on the terrace while I'm not home? And why do you always talk about him when I'm not around?" She smiled, and that smile only made me feel more alienated. "You're getting yourself all worked up again," she said softly, but with a hint of irritation in her voice. "I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this. Chester and I have been friends for a long time, and that doesn't mean there's anything more to it than that." I wanted to believe her words, but something inside me was screaming that it wasn't true. It wasn't just friendship. I saw their looks, saw them laughing together, and I knew something was different. My thoughts were filled with suspicion, but I still couldn't put the pieces of this puzzle together. "I just don't like that you've started spending so much time with him," I said, lowering my gaze. "It just seems weird." "Weird?" She grinned. "Jeffrey, you're overthinking this. Chester and I are just friends, and that's never going to change. I need you, and he just helps me relax sometimes. You know I love you, so why make it up as you go along?" Her words sounded so convincing, but I couldn't wave away my anxiety any longer. With each passing day, I could feel our relationship with Jessica drifting further away from what we once called love. Words that once seemed sincere now sounded hollow and lifeless. Even her assurances that there was nothing between her and Chester couldn't make me shake off my growing doubts. I tried to regain even a shadow of the trust we'd had before, but every time I looked at her, something inside me tugged, as if I'd lost something important that couldn't be regained. After our conversation about Chester, Jessica pretended like nothing much had happened. She acted like her usual self, smiling, laughing, trying to do chores around the house, but I couldn't help but notice that there was a tension between us that wouldn't go away. It was like a dark cloud hanging over our lives, and it seemed impossible to disperse. One evening, I decided to take my mind off my thoughts and asked Jessica to spend the evening alone with me. We hadn't had many moments like this lately, and I wanted to bring back the closeness that we used to have between us. I ordered dinner from our favorite restaurant, lit candles, and put on some quiet music. We were supposed to be together like we used to be, like two people who appreciate and love each other. Jessica accepted my proposal at first, but her look was blank, like none of this mattered to her. She sat down at the table, crossed her arms over her chest, and remained silent, looking somewhere off to the side. I tried to start a conversation, asking about her day, but her answers were one-word answers, like she was just trying to wait out the evening. We ate in silence. With each bite, I could feel the distance between us growing. I couldn't take it anymore. Everything I'd tried to hold on to was disintegrating right before my eyes. "Jessica," I finally said, unable to hide my feelings any longer. "I can feel you pulling away. I can't keep pretending everything's okay. What's going on with us?" She looked up at me, her face still calm, but I saw something in her eyes that wasn't there before: indifference. It was a cold, indifferent expression that made me shudder. It was the worst of it. Not anger, not resentment, just a lack of emotion. "Nothing's going on, Jeff," she said calmly, as if she were talking about something insignificant. "We're just a little distant, it happens. There's no need to make this harder than it has to be." I felt my heart clench with pain. She spoke as if our 4 years together had been something insignificant, as if our lives were just a collection of random moments that no longer mattered. But it meant everything to me. "But it's not just a little bit, Jessica," I said, feeling my voice trailing off. "I can see how different you've become. You're spending more and more time with Chester, and every time you're with him, I feel like I'm losing you. You can't just brush it off." She was silent for a few seconds, and I saw a slight shadow of irritation appear on her face. She finally put down her fork and looked straight at me. "You're starting all this again, aren't you?" she said with a slight chuckle. "Chester and I are friends. We've always been friends. Why are you suddenly jealous? Why do you think there's something between us?" I couldn't hold it in anymore. Everything I've been feeling for months came out. "Because you've changed," I shouted, not even realizing I'd raised my voice. "You're not the same person you used to be. You don't tell me what's going on in your life. You hide your affairs, and you spend more and more time with him. You don't realize how much it hurts to see someone you love walk away while you stay put." Jessica looked at me with a cold, indifferent expression. She sighed, as if I was boring her with my worries. "Jeffrey, you're making a big deal out of this again," she said indifferently. "I'm not cheating on you, and I never have. You're just being overthinking. Maybe you should mind your own business more and think less about these things." Her words hit me harder than I expected. It was like a slap in the face. As I looked at her, I realized that something inside of me had broken down completely. I couldn't take her indifference anymore. My pain was real, and she wasn't going to see it. That night, I went to sleep in a separate room. I just couldn't stand to be around her. Every time I saw her face full of indifference, I felt like I was losing another part of myself. We didn't talk about what happened at dinner anymore, but it got worse after that. Jessica didn't try to explain anything, didn't try to bring back the closeness between us. She continued to live her life as if I no longer existed. I began to notice that she was spending more and more time away from home, and her trips became more frequent and longer. When I asked her where she was going, she would only give me a short answer: business or meeting a friend. But Jessica's friends had long since disappeared from our lives, and all her errands were beginning to seem more and more dubious. She still had her phone on her, and every time it rang or a text came in, she tried to make sure I didn't notice. One day, as she was about to go out again, I couldn't help myself and asked, "Where are you going?" She quickly threw on her jacket without looking at me and replied, "I'm meeting Chester. There's something we need to talk about." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Chester had become a constant figure in her life, and every time his name came out of her mouth, I felt like our relationship was finally crumbling. I couldn't believe a word she said anymore. "You're spending too much time with him, Jessica," I said, trying to stay calm, but my voice was trembling. "I don't understand why you spend more time with him than you do with me." She paused for a moment, turned to me and grinned, but there was only irritation in her eyes. "I don't have to explain my every move to you, Jeffrey. You're not following me, are you?" Her words were spoken with such coldness that I couldn't answer at once. She stood in front of me, beautiful, confident, as if she knew she had power over me. And that feeling was the most agonizing. She knew I loved her too much to walk away. And I think she played on that because she knew that no matter how much I suffered, I couldn't just leave her. "I'm not following you," I replied, feeling the words struggle to come out. "But I want to know what's going on between us. Why don't you want to spend time with me anymore?" She only grinned and walked out the door without answering. I was left alone, standing in the hallway, feeling the pain and frustration growing inside me again. That evening had been a turning point for me. I could no longer pretend that everything was normal. All this time I had been trying to convince myself that our relationship could still be saved, that I could somehow make a difference. But after I saw her indifference, I realized it was over. I had nothing more to offer her. The last few weeks passed in a dragging wait, and my anxiety only grew. Everything that was going on between Jessica and Chester became obvious, but I still couldn't find any proof. My imagination was playing wicked tricks on me, and every detail her evasive answers, his endless presence seemed like clues, but they remained mere guesses. I couldn't put up with these thoughts any longer. I needed to see everything with my own eyes, as painful as it was. One evening, Jessica was about to leave again. Her movements were quick, almost fidgety, as if she wanted to get away from me as soon as possible. She cast a brief, almost blank look at me, and without waiting for my response, said, "I'm going to a meeting. I'll be back soon." I nodded, barely containing the anxiety that was spreading more and more inside me. She walked out of the house, leaving only silence behind her. I waited a few minutes, so as not to give away my intentions, and throwing on my jacket, followed her. This time I decided I had to find out the truth, no matter how brutal the blow would be. I knew where she was headed. Every time she said she was going to meet Chester, she almost always went to his house. This time I was sure I wouldn't be wrong. As I approached his house, her car was already parked on the sidewalk. My suspicions were confirmed. I stopped for a moment, feeling my heart clench with pain and anticipation of what I was about to see. I approached the house quietly, trying not to make a sound. I didn't know what awaited me behind the door, but the sense of inevitability became unbearable. As I climbed the steps, I stood at the entrance for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts. The lights were on the second floor, and I realized they were upstairs. This was the moment when my hunches were either going to be confirmed or shattered. I couldn't stay in the dark any longer. The door, as always, was unlocked. I slowly turned the knob and stepped inside, trying to move as quietly as possible. The house was quiet, with only a slight noise coming from upstairs. I walked to the stairs and began to climb, not knowing what I would see but prepared for the worst. Every movement I made seemed too loud, as if the house might betray my presence. When I reached the second floor, I heard muffled sounds coming from the bedroom. For a moment, I froze, feeling my heart sink. It wasn't just talking. I heard moaning. My head spun with shock and I lost control of my own body for a moment. This was really happening. I could no longer close my eyes to what I had tried to deny for so long. I stepped forward and saw them, Jessica and Chester, in the bed. They were so engrossed in each other that they didn't even notice my presence. Their bodies were entwined and I stared at it, unable to believe what was happening. It was like I was in some kind of nightmare from which there was no escape. The scene before me was so real that I could no longer hope that it was just a figment of my imagination. It was as if my body no longer obeyed me. I froze, watching them, and felt a wave of revulsion wash over me. I couldn't utter a word. The sound of their breathing, Jessica's muffled moans, it all pierced through me, tearing me apart. It was the truth I'd been trying to avoid, and now it stood before me, unadorned and undeniable. Suddenly I realized I couldn't take it anymore. Everything I'd been feeling, the anger, the pain, the betrayal, came together into one huge, suffocating feeling that was about to tear me from the inside out. I turned around and almost on automatic walked out of the room, flinging the door shut behind me. They didn't notice me leaving. Their world was closed to me. I ran down the stairs, feeling my legs give out, and ran out of the house and into the street. The cold air hit my face, but it didn't help. I gasped at the pain that overwhelmed me. I stopped, leaning against the wall, and at that moment I was turned inside out. My chest squeezed, and I felt my stomach twist with revulsion. I threw up right into the street, and I couldn't stop. When the vomiting stopped, I was breathing heavily, feeling weakness engulf my entire body. I sank to my knees, unable to contain the physical or emotional pain any longer. Everything I knew, everything I loved, was now shattered. The scene I saw would haunt me for the rest of my life. I closed my eyes, but it didn't help. Images of Jessica and Chester continued to stand in front of me like ghosts that couldn't be forgotten. Everything I heard, everything I saw was the truth from which there was no escape. I don't know how long I spent outside. It seemed like an eternity before I could get up and force myself to get out of there. Tears were stinging my eyes, but I couldn't let them out. I was devastated to the max, and there was nothing else to do. It had been a few days since I'd caught Jessica and Chester together. Those days stretched into endless agony. I spent all that time in a cheap hotel room, far from home, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The only thing running through my mind was the image of their entwined bodies and how easily they betrayed me, not knowing I'd seen them. I turned my phone off for a few days. I didn't want to hear Jessica's voice or anyone else's. I felt like everything around me was falling apart, and no matter how hard I tried to hold on, I couldn't handle it alone anymore. Every time I tried to figure out what had gone wrong, her laugh, the same one I'd heard when they were together, sounded in my head. My own thoughts kept me on my toes. On the fourth day, when I turned on my phone, an avalanche of missed calls and messages awaited me. Jessica had called a few times, as expected, but among her messages was something unexpected. Chester had also been trying to contact me. He called me several times, and that only added to the anger that was boiling inside of me. "Jeff, where are you? We need to talk," is what I saw in one of his messages, as if we had any business left in common after what he'd done. I turned my phone off, trying to suppress the urge to answer him. I couldn't. My heart was shattered into tiny shards, and the anger was literally consuming me. But hours later, when I turned my phone back on, he called again. This time, I couldn't help myself and answered. "Jeff? Finally!" Chester's voice sounded worried, but there was no remorse or fear in it, like he really thought he could explain himself. "Where have you been? We need to talk. I owe you an explanation." I was silent for a few seconds, holding back the rage that came over me with renewed intensity. How could he talk to me so calmly, knowing he was sleeping with my wife? Talk? My words sounded cold, but I couldn't keep the tremor out of my voice. "You seriously want to talk after what you did? How could you?" There was a sepulchral silence on the other end of the line. I imagined he was probably trying to find the words, but I had no desire to hear his excuses. "Jeff, I know this sounds awful," he finally said, but his voice was too calm for the situation. "But you have to understand." "Understand?" I interrupted him, feeling my anger come over me. "Am I supposed to understand something? You slept with my wife, Chester. How can you even say anything after that?" I heard him sigh heavily on the other end of the line, but there was no remorse or apology in his tone, just some empty words. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said finally. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I didn't want you to find out." The words hit me harder than I'd expected. Didn't want me to find out? You mean he was going to keep betraying me behind my back without me noticing? In that moment, I realized that not only was I facing a betrayal of my wife, but also a betrayal of my best friend. Everything I knew about Chester was a lie. "You've never been my friend," I said, my voice breaking with rage and pain. "All this time, you were just pretending that you cared about our relationship, but really you were just waiting for the moment to sleep with her. Jeff, that's not true." He tried to intervene, but I didn't want to hear it anymore. Shut up, I shouted, unable to hold back. Don't you dare say another word to me. You betrayed me, Chester. You took everything we had and threw it in the trash. We've been friends all our lives, and you just destroyed it for what? For fun? I heard him trying to say something again, but his words didn't matter anymore. Nothing he could say could restore my faith in people, my faith in friendship or love. We're not friends anymore, Chester, I said quietly, almost a whisper. And we'll never be again. I disconnected the call, feeling everything inside of me tearing up. The pain of realizing that my best friend and my wife had betrayed me was unbearable. Their voices, their faces, their lies. It all haunted me, not giving me a moment's peace. I was alone in my hotel room, feeling my soul slowly dying. Everything I believed in, everything that love and friendship had once meant to me was now shattered. I couldn't believe in anyone anymore. If Chester, the man I had known since childhood, turned out to be like this, how could I trust anyone else? Weeks passed, but the pain wouldn't let go. I lived in this void, not knowing how to move on. Love, friendship, they all seemed like empty words to me now. Every attempt to think about the future, about starting a new relationship, was impossible for me. I couldn't trust people anymore. Jessica and Chester didn't call anymore. They must have realized it was over, but it didn't matter. I knew I could never love again. My heart was broken, and I saw no way to heal it. It had been a few days since I ended my conversation with Chester. The anger and pain still tore me apart, but I realized I couldn't hide from reality in a cheap hotel room indefinitely. I avoided going home for as long as I could, but the need to face Jessica again wouldn't let go. I needed to close this chapter of my life, no matter how hard it was. I knew I had to go home and deal with what was left of our marriage. I slowly headed back, taking my time and delaying the inevitable. Different emotions were bubbling inside of me: rage, sadness, devastation. I still couldn't fully realize how it was that Jessica and Chester had betrayed me so easily without thinking of the consequences. But there was another feeling I tried to ignore. I still wanted to hear an explanation from her, maybe even remorse. As I approached our house, my heart pounded harder. Jessica's car was parked in its spot, and I knew she was inside. Walking up the steps, I stood at the door for a moment, trying to gather the strength to go in. I was ready for anything: her tears, her excuses, her remorse. But what I saw inside was far worse than I could have expected. Jessica was sitting in the living room. Her face was perfectly calm, with no signs of stress or guilt. She turned toward me as I walked in, but didn't rise from her seat. Her expression was cold, even indifferent, as if she was waiting for me not as a husband but as a stranger. "We must talk," she said, as if she had prepared for this conversation in advance. I stopped on the threshold, feeling my insides clench. Did she really think she could just keep acting like nothing had happened? Her calmness was frightening, as if she didn't realize I'd caught her with someone else. "Yes, we should," I answered, looking at her. "But I think you should start. Explain, Jessica. How did this happen? Why did you do it?" She looked at me as if my words had no meaning. Her eyes remained cold, and in that moment I realized there would be no remorse. "Jeffrey," she finally said with a sigh, "we should have discussed this a long time ago. I want a divorce." The words hit me like a thunderclap. A divorce? I was ready for any explanation, for an attempt to save our relationship or at least for her remorse. But not this. She said it as if it were something everyday, insignificant. Her voice didn't waver. She didn't look away. She really had decided it was over. "Divorced?" I asked her again, not believing my ears. "You say that as if everything we had between us didn't mean anything anymore." She sighed again, as if she was tired of this conversation. "Exactly," she replied calmly. "I don't want to continue our relationship anymore. It's not because I hate you or anything like that. It's just, it ended a long time ago, and we both know it." Her indifference was so painful that I could barely breathe. I expected anything: tears, remorse, maybe an attempt to explain myself. But instead, she just stated the fact, as if it were something mundane, something that didn't deserve an emotional response. She spoke as if our 4 years together were nothing to her. "Aren't you even going to try to explain?" I asked. feeling the anger rising up inside me again. You just want a divorce after you betrayed me with my best friend? Don't you really care? Jessica finally stood up, her eyes glittering with coldness. She stepped closer and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. I don't have to justify myself to you, she said sharply. You already know what happened anyway. Yes, I was with Chester. And yes, our relationship with you was doomed. Why can't you just admit that? We're not the same person we used to be. Did you think you could hold on to me just because we'd been together for so long? I was stunned by her words. Not only was she not sorry for what she'd done, but she was trying to manipulate my feelings, suggesting that it was my fault that things had fallen apart. Her confidence, her pressure, it was an unexpected blow to my already wounded soul. Are you saying it was my fault? I asked, hardly believing my ears. Are you saying I made you cheat on me? She shrugged, her face remaining as cold as ice. I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm just saying that our relationship ended a long time ago. You could have realized that sooner, but you chose to cling to something that had long since fallen apart. And now you're blaming me for finally doing something I should have done a long time ago. Her words sounded so cruel that I couldn't hold back any longer. I expected remorse, expected her to at least try to explain her actions. But instead, she was accusing me of trying to hold on to something that no longer mattered to her. Are you saying I should have just accepted it? I shouted, unable to contain my emotions any longer. That I was supposed to just watch you betray me and pretend everything was okay? You think you can just ruin our lives like that and walk away without explaining yourself? She stood in front of me, unblinking. Her face remained as calm as it had been at the beginning of the conversation. She wasn't going to apologize. She wasn't going to say she was sorry. She was just putting me on the spot. I've already said everything, Jeffrey, she replied coldly. Our life wasn't ruined now. It had been ruined for a long time, and now it's just over. Accept it. I stared at her, not believing my ears. This wasn't the Jessica I knew, the one I'd spent so much time with, the one I loved. She spoke to me like I was a stranger, like our years together were just a mistake she wanted to forget. You've already made your decision, I said quietly, feeling the tears come to my eyes. But you know what? You ruined everything. You didn't just destroy our relationship, you destroyed my faith in people. Jessica looked at me with a slight squint, as if considering my words, but there was no regret or remorse in her eyes. She turned away, signaling that the conversation was over. You're right, she said quietly. I ruined it, but it had to be. I remained standing there, stunned by her cold demeanor. She no longer looked at me as a husband, as the man she had once loved. That was the end of it. After that conversation with Jessica, when she confronted me with the fact of the divorce, I left our home, and my existence was plunged into a never-ending sense of loss. She hadn't just destroyed our relationship. She had destroyed everything I believed in. I couldn't understand how the person I loved could push me away so coldly. Her indifference was the hardest blow I could not comprehend. I never went home again. The hotel room became a temporary refuge for me, a place where I could hide from everyone. At first, I tried to find a way out of this situation, tried to understand how I could live on, but every day I felt that it was impossible. I kept thinking that love, trust, and everything I had ever considered important was fragile and unreliable. I became withdrawn, distant from friends and family, unwilling to share my feelings with anyone. Everything inside of me burned out. My thoughts went back to the moment I'd caught Jessica and Chester, to their carefree faces, to how easily they'd betrayed me. I thought about how she had then calmly told me that she wanted a divorce, and that our relationship had been doomed long ago. It was eating me up from the inside out. The love that I thought was the foundation of life now seemed meaningless to me. How could I ever trust someone again? Every time I saw couples in love on the street, I was overcome with bitterness. These people were living in a world of illusion, just as I once had. But I knew it could all crumble at any moment. How can one believe in sincerity again? How can one love again? Time passed, and I remained in a state of emptiness. I couldn't eat, sleep, or work. My whole life became an endless wait for the pain to subside, but it never did. My heart was broken and I couldn't find a way to repair it. Every day was like the previous one, equally gray and joyless. One day, an old friend with whom we hadn't spoken for a long time wrote me a message suggesting we meet. I hesitated for a long time, but finally agreed. Maybe I just needed to get out of the four walls to unwind. We met in a cafe, and he started talking about his life, his work, how things were going. I listened, but I could barely concentrate on what he was saying. "How are you?" he asked suddenly, noticing my detached expression. I froze. I wanted to say that I was fine, that I was coping, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I squeezed out the truth. I saw her with someone else. Jessica cheated on me with Chester. My friend froze, then slowly shook his head. God, Jeff, I don't even know what to say. Don't say anything, I interrupted him, feeling a deafening pain rise up inside. It wouldn't change anything. He wanted to say something, to offer support, but I couldn't listen to any more consolation. I realized that his words, like any other man's words, were incapable of giving me back what had been lost. How can you believe in sincerity again when you've been betrayed by those who should have been closest to you? We parted quickly. I returned to the hotel, feeling that every conversation, every attempt to explain what was happening only deepened my pain. Everything I knew was shattered. Every time I thought of Jessica, I saw her cold smile, her indifferent gaze. I couldn't forget that. I couldn't forgive her. The days continued to drag on, endlessly slow. I stopped seeing my friends, stopped answering their calls. My life narrowed to the confines of my hotel room and short walks on empty streets. I didn't know how to move on anymore. All my dreams of a future with Jessica, of family life and love, crumbled in an instant. There was nothing left inside me but emptiness. I no longer believed in love. Every thought of a new relationship, of the possibility of starting over, seemed empty and meaningless to me. I couldn't trust people anymore. If those I loved most in the world could betray me so easily, how could I open my heart again? Every morning when I woke up, I felt like I didn't want to get out of bed anymore. Life had lost its colors. Everything that once seemed important now had no meaning. I no longer knew what to live for. Even simple pleasures, such as a walk in the park or reading a book, didn't bring joy. In every corner of my mind, there was only the pain of betrayal. I began to shun people, to avoid contact. Whenever I saw couples in love on the street, it physically hurt me. How could they smile so sincerely at each other? How could they believe that their love would last forever? I knew it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. Love is a fragile illusion that is easily shattered. My depression was getting deeper and deeper. I tried to distract myself, but to no avail. Jessica and Chester were always in my thoughts. Their betrayal poisoned my every day. Whenever I tried to make myself believe that I could move on with my life, their images came back, reminding me that I was no longer capable of trusting. One day I was sitting on the edge of my bed in my hotel and suddenly realized that I didn't want anything more. I didn't want to start a new relationship. I didn't want to build a future. Everything I had turned out to be a lie, and I couldn't find the strength to continue. Even the very thought of trusting someone again made me fearful and disgusted. I knew now that I could never love again. My heart was broken, and no amount of consolation, no new relationship could change that. All I had left were memories of how love could be destroyed, and I wasn't willing to take that risk anymore.